All I ever wanted was a peaceful retirement by the Lakia quiet cabin, a worn fishing chair, and the sound of water lapping against the dock each morning. After 35 years designing bridges and dams that spanned rivers and shaped skylines, I thought I'd earned that much. My name is Thomas Miller, and at 67, I believed I'd left behind the world of blueprints, permits, and property disputes for good. Silver Lake had been my sanctuary long before retirement. I'd purchased the modest lakefront property 15 years earlier as my eventual escape plan, a place where stress dissolved into still waters and deadlines melted into sunsets. The cabin wasn't fancy. Cedar siding weathered to a soft gray, a stone fireplace that kept the chill away during Minnesota winters, and a dock that stretched 20 feet into the clear blue water. What made it perfect wasn't luxury, but legacy. This was where I'd teach my grandchildren to fish, where I'd watch the seasons change without the pressure of conference calls, where I'd finally finish reading Moby Dick. I'd been retired for exactly 5 months and 16 days when I heard the unmistakable sound of metal striking metal where no such sound belonged. I set down my coffee, pushed myself out of my Adirondack chair, and followed the noise around the side path that led to my dock access. There it stood, a wrought iron gate, black, ornate, and utterly absurd, installed across my private lake entrance, complete with a shiny brass padlock and a freshly mounted sign that read, "Silver Shores HOA authorized access only." It blocked the path I'd walked every morning since I'd owned the property. Above the gate, a small security camera with a blinking red light stared down at me like an accusation. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't authorized this. I hadn't been notified about this. And I certainly hadn't agreed to have my access restricted on what I knew was my property. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from behind me, a sing-song tone dripping with self-satisfaction. I turned to find myself face-to-face with Diane Ellsworth, the recently elected president of the Silver Shores Homeowners Association. She was immaculately dressed in pressed khakis and a pale blue cardigan despite the early hour. Clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, silver blonde hair arranged in what I'd come to think of as the suburban commander, cut short, practical, and intimidating. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing toward the gate with my free hand. "Community improvement," Diane replied, her smile never reaching her eyes. "The HOA board voted to enhance security and aesthetic appeal of our lake access points. It's all in the newsletter." "I don't receive your newsletter," I pointed out. "I'm not a member of your HOA." Her smile tightened just slightly. "Well, perhaps you should be." Regardless, this particular stretch of land, she consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. Specifically, the 15-foot corridor from your property line to the water's edge has been acquired by the association through a proper lease agreement with the county. "That's impossible," I said, though a knot formed in my stomach. "My property extends to the water." Diane's eyes gleamed with the distinct satisfaction of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. "Actually, Mr. Miller, if you check your property survey, you'll find that the narrow strip where the old bait shop once stood reverted to county jurisdiction after Old Man Jenkins passed away last year. The county put it up for lease, and the association secured it for community use." She handed me a photocopy of what appeared to be a lease agreement. "We're simply exercising our rights to manage authorized access." I scanned the document, years of reviewing technical contracts allowing me to spot the relevant details despite my mounting frustration. It appeared that the small strip of land approximately 15 feet wide where it crossed my lake access had indeed been leased by the Silver Shores HOA. What the document didn't explain was why I hadn't been notified about this transaction that directly affected my property. "And the gate?" I asked, working to keep my voice level. "The camera?" "Security measures," Diane replied smoothly. "We've had reports of non-residents using our private lake access. The camera ensures that only authorized individuals with proper permits can enter." She produced a small, laminated card from her pocket. "This is your temporary access permit. The permanent card will be issued after you've registered with the association and paid the requisite community improvement fee." Fee. The word came out sharper than I intended. "Of course. Lake maintenance doesn't pay for itself, Mr. Miller." The annual contribution is $850, due by the 1st of next month. The association will also need you to complete these compliance forms. She handed me a thick envelope. You'll find our community standards regarding dock appearance, approved fishing hours, and guest policies inside. We do value our residents' recreational activities, but within appropriate guidelines. I looked from the envelope to the gate to Diane's smug expression and felt something I hadn't experienced since I'd retired. The distinct burn of professional indignation. As a civil engineer, I'd spent decades navigating property disputes, easements, and public access issues. I knew when something didn't add up. I'll look into this, I said finally, tucking the envelope under my arm. Please do, Diane replied with rehearsed pleasantness. The gate code is temporarily set to 1234. We'll change it once all residents have received their permanent access cards. She checked her watch. Oh, I'm late for our landscape compliance meeting. Do review those materials, Mr. Miller. The association takes violations quite seriously. As she walked away, clipboard still clutched her chest. I stood silently fuming. The gate, that ridiculous, unnecessary gate, stood between me and the retirement I'd planned for decades. The lake I'd watched through office windows on late work nights. The peace I'd promised myself after years of stress and sacrifice. I tried the temporary code. The lock clicked open. I pushed through the gate, letting it clang shut behind me, and made my way down to my dock. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting golden ripples across the water. But the tranquility I usually felt at this spot had been replaced by a simmering frustration. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following weeks saw a quiet but determined war unfold between myself and the Silver Shores HOA. I began by researching, pulling out old surveys of my property, and reviewing the original deed. As I suspected, there was a discrepancy. While the narrow strip had technically been separate from my parcel on the original plat, I had documentation showing an easement that granted my property permanent access rights. Armed with this information, I attended the next HOA meeting held in the community center on the north shore of the lake. Diane presided from a table at the front, flanked by her board members, mostly retirees like myself, but with a distinct air of people who'd found in retirement a new career in monitoring their neighbors' activities. When the floor opened for community comments, I presented my case clearly and calmly, citing the easement and questioning the legality of restricting my access. The response was immediate and predictable. The association's legal counsel has reviewed all documentation, Diane replied, not even bothering to look at the papers I brought. The easement in question was specific to the bait shop's operation and expired with its closure. The gate installation complies with all county regulations. Before I could respond, she moved on to the next agenda item, a heated discussion about permissible mailbox colors. I left the meeting knowing that reason and documentation wouldn't be enough. I needed to try another approach. I went through proper channels next to the county recorder's office, where I discovered that while the HOA had indeed secured a lease, there were irregularities in how it had been processed. The required notifications to adjacent property owners, including myself, had been administratively overlooked. It was a technical error, but not enough to invalidate the lease entirely. I filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board, which granted me a hearing. Diane and the HOA's lawyer appeared, armed with countering documents and claiming that notifications had been sent via the HOA newsletter publication I didn't receive since I wasn't a member. The board issued a compromise. The lease would stand, but the HOA would be required to provide reasonable accommodation for my access. Diane's interpretation of reasonable accommodation was to drop the annual fee to $500 and extend my temporary access code for another 30 days. The gate remained locked. The camera continued its silent surveillance of my comings and goings. And now, I began receiving courtesy notices about violations I didn't know existed. My dock needed repainting in an approved color. My fishing chair was visible from the community path, and thus an aesthetic concern. My kayak storage didn't meet the watercraft containment standards. Each notice came with a specific compliance timeline and a veiled threat of fines. Each was signed with Diane's flowing signature, and a smiley face that seemed more menacing than friendly. I didn't bend. I didn't comply. And I certainly didn't pay. Instead, I began talking to my neighbors, not the board members who followed Diane like well-dressed disciples, but the regular folks who, like me, just wanted to enjoy their homes without constant scrutiny. Frank and Elaine Morris, a retired schoolteacher couple 3 doors down. Ben Sullivan, a former park ranger who'd built his cabin himself. Maria Vasquez, a widow who'd moved to the lake after her husband passed, looking for peace and finding instead a regime of regulations. They all had stories. Fines for bird feeders that attracted non-approved wildlife. Warnings for garden gnomes deemed excessive ornamentation. A notice of violation for wind chimes that exceeded the ambient noise guidelines. Small battles fought and usually lost in the face of Diane's relentless enforcement. "Why do you all put up with it?" I asked Frank one evening as we stood on his back deck, watching the sunset turn the lake to fire. He shrugged, a tired gesture from a man who'd taught middle schoolers for 4 decades. "Pick your battles, Tom. Most folks just want a quiet life. Diane makes it easier to comply than to fight, even when she's wrong. Especially then," he said with a sad smile. "You've got the energy for this war. Some of us are just too tired." His words stayed with me that night as I sat on my dock, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the pilings. I understood the fatigue he described. After decades of professional battles, I'd come here seeking peace, not conflict. But some things were worth fighting for, especially when the alternative was surrendering to petty tyranny disguised as community standards. The next morning, I took direct action. I purchased bolt cutters from the hardware store in town and snipped the padlock clean off the gate. I replaced it with my own lock, leaving it unlocked but sending a clear message. This was now my gate. The reaction was swift. By afternoon, a notice of critical violation had been taped to my front door, informing me that tampering with association property was subject to a $750 fine and potential legal action. By evening, a maintenance crew had replaced my lock with a new association padlock and installed a second security camera aimed directly at my cabin. The following day, I received a certified letter from the association's attorney threatening litigation if I interfered with association property again. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Diane's distinctive script. "This could all be so simple if you'd just join the community, Tom." I knew then that direct confrontation wouldn't work. I needed to be smarter, more strategic. I needed to find the one thing Diane and her association had overlooked. And then, while reviewing the county property records yet again, I found Ida's sliver of hope in the form of a separate, overlooked parcel. The old bait shop parcel that the HOA had leased wasn't a single, uniform strip of land. There was a small, adjacent triangle of property less than 500 square feet and had been separately deeded decades ago. It had belonged to Old Man Jenkins' sister, who had moved to Alaska in the 1980s and apparently forgotten she owned it. Now that she had passed away, her daughter had inherited Ida, a woman named Sarah Jenkins who lived in Anchorage and had listed the tiny parcel for sale, probably unaware of its strategic importance. The critical detail: this small triangle of land included the precise spot where the HOA's gate was anchored on one side. I contacted Sarah Jenkins immediately, explaining that I was interested in her small parcel on Silver Lake. She was surprised anyone would want what she called that worthless scrap, but was happy to discuss terms. I offered a fair price, significantly more than the assessed value, but still within my means, and emphasized my desire to complete the transaction quickly and quietly. Within 3 weeks, the deed was transferred and properly recorded with the county. I now owned the land where one side of the association's gate was mounted. I owned the post it was attached to. I owned the ground beneath it. I didn't act immediately. I took my time, consulting with a real estate attorney to confirm my rights and responsibilities. I documented the exact boundaries with photographs and measurements. I filed the appropriate notices with the county recorder. And only then, when everything was legally squared away, did I make my move. On a crisp Saturday morning, as association members gathered at the community center for their monthly lake preservation breakfast, I walked down to the gate with a new padlock, a laminated sign, and a calm determination that had carried me through countless professional challenges. I removed the association's lock. I installed my own, and I hung a professionally printed sign that read, "Private property access by owner permission only. Inquiries to Thomas Miller, Lot 47." Then I sat in my fishing chair on the dock and waited. It didn't take long. The breakfast meeting apparently adjourned early when someone noticed the change on the security camera feed. A procession of khaki pants and pastel tops marched down the community path, led by Diane, her face flushed with what I could only describe as righteous HOA fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, brandishing her ever-present clipboard like a weapon. "This is association property." With deliberate calm, I handed her a folder containing copies of my newly recorded deed, the property survey highlighting the boundaries, and a letter from my attorney explaining my rights as the new owner of the parcel. "Actually, Diane, this gate is anchored on my property. The post, the hinges, and approximately 3 feet of your fence line now belong to me. I'm merely securing my private property, as is my right." The confusion on her face was worth every penny I'd paid for that small triangle of land. She flipped through the documents, her composed facade crumbling with each page. This is impossible," she stammered. "The association controls lake access. The association leases a portion of the shoreline." I corrected her gently. "But you built your gate on land that now belongs to me. I'm happy to discuss an easement agreement if the association would like to continue using my property for their gate. My attorney has drafted some reasonable terms." I handed her another document, a proposed easement agreement that would grant the HOA permission to maintain their gate on my land under specific conditions. Unrestricted access for all lakefront property owners, removal of surveillance cameras targeting private residences, and the dissolution of any access fees for homeowners with deeded lake rights. Diane's face cycled through emotion: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, a grudging recognition that she'd been outmaneuvered. "The board will need to review this," she said stiffly, tucking the documents under her clipboard. "Of course," I replied pleasantly. "In the meantime, I'll maintain control of the access point, as is my legal right as the property owner. I do value community, Diane, just not at the expense of individual dignity." The group retreated in disarray, whispered conferences breaking out among them as they made their way back to the community center. I remained on my dock, enjoying the suddenly sweeter taste of my morning coffee and the unobstructed view of the water. By afternoon, the story had spread throughout the small community. My phone began ringing with calls from neighbors I barely knew, some congratulating me, others asking if they could now access the lake without an association permit. Frank Morris brought over a 6-pack of beer, laughing harder than I'd ever seen him laugh. "You found the one thing she couldn't control," he said, clinking his bottle against mine in a toast. "The actual property." "Engineering background," I replied with a smile. "Always check the foundation before you start building." The HOA's response unfolded in stages, much like the 5 stages of grief. First came denial and emergency board meeting, where Diane insisted my purchase was invalid. It wasn't. Then a strongly worded letter from their attorney threatening litigation, which my attorney confidently dismissed. Bargaining followed, a counterproposal offering to purchase my triangle of land for twice what I'd paid. I declined. Depression manifested as a somber community update, newsletter warning of declining standards due to unresolved access issues. And finally, faced with residents increasingly questioning their tactics, the association reached acceptance. They agreed to my easement terms, though not without attempting to add numerous conditions and restrictions that my attorney systematically removed during negotiations. The gate remained, but now it stayed unlocked during daylight hours. The cameras were redirected to monitor only common areas, not private property, and the lake access permits became purely voluntary, a symbol of Diane's diminished authority. But the story didn't end there. Having tasted victory, other residents began questioning rules they'd previously accepted without complaint. Ben Sullivan challenged the ban on native plantings and lakefront landscapes, presenting research on how indigenous species actually improved water quality. Maria Vasquez organized a wind chime symphony, where a dozen homeowners simultaneously displayed the previously forbidden decorations. The HOA's formerly unchallenged control began to erode in 100 small ways. Diane, predictably, didn't surrender her power gracefully. Unable to target me directly, she shifted tactics. Suddenly, board members were conducting water quality inspections near my dock, taking samples and making notes with exaggerated concern. Anonymous complaints were filed with the county about unauthorized structures on my property, triggering inspections that found nothing. Flyers appeared warning about non-compliant docks with poorly disguised photographs of my property. The pettiness reached a crescendo when the association attempted to extend their reach by water. One Saturday morning, I emerged from my cabin to find association-marked kayaks and paddle boats deliberately docking along my shoreline, their occupants claiming they were conducting an aquatic vegetation survey. It was a thinly veiled invasion, testing whether they could access my property from the water, if not through the gate. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I contacted the county water management office, which confirmed that while the lake itself was public, deliberate docking on private property without permission constituted trespassing. A county official came out, assessed the situation, and ordered the removal of the survey team and the unauthorized buoys Diane had installed to mark what she called the community water zone. That evening, as I sat on my dock watching the sunset, I heard footsteps on the path. Diane appeared at the gate, alone this time, no clipboard in sight. She looked smaller somehow, less commanding without her usual entourage of board members. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the gate. I nodded, curious about this unexpected solo visit. She walked down to the dock, her posture stiff, and stood for a moment looking out at the water before speaking. "You know, I'm not the villain you think I am," she said finally, still facing the lake. "Everything I've done has been to protect property values and maintain standards. This community was falling apart before I took over." "There's a difference between maintenance and control, Diane," I replied. "Between standards and uniformity." She turned to look at me then, and I saw something unexpected in her express-iona flicker of genuine concern, perhaps even vulnerability. "Do you know why I joined the board in the first place?" she asked. I shook my head. 5 years ago, the lakefront was a mess. Abandoned docks, invasive plants, choking the shoreline, property values tanking because nobody cared enough to maintain basic standards. My husband and I put our life savings into our place, and we were watching it deteriorate because there was no coordination, no oversight. Her voice had lost its usual administrative crispness. I didn't start out wanting to count garden gnomes or measure grass height. I just wanted to protect our investment, all of ours. For a moment, I saw the situation through her eyes, how easy it would be to slip from genuine concern into rigid control, one small rule at a time. "That doesn't justify what you've done," I said, but my tone had softened. "Putting up gates, installing surveillance, issuing fines over wind chime stats, not protection. It's overreach." She sighed, a sound of genuine fatigue. "Perhaps. But without structure, without consequences, people don't comply. They let things slide until suddenly everyone's property is worth less because nobody wants to live next to a junkyard. There's a middle ground," I suggested. "Guidelines without governance. Recommendations without requirements." Diane gave a short laugh. "You're an idealist, Mr. Miller. People need rules. People need respect," I countered. "Treat them like responsible adults instead of unruly children, and they might surprise you." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze returning to the lake, now painted in twilight purples and deep blues. Finally, she straightened her shoulders, reverting to her more familiar, administrative self. "The board is considering significant revisions to our community guidelines," she said, her tone formal once again. "Your situation has prompted some reflection on our approaches. We'll be holding a special session next Tuesday to discuss more collaborative methods of maintaining community standards. Your input would be not unwelcome. It wasn't quite an olive branch, but it was something close to recognition. I nodded, accepting the invitation without pressing further. As she turned to leave, she paused at the gate. You know, I looked you up after a first encounter. 35 years in civil engineering. Projects across 3 states. You could have mentioned your professional background. I smiled slightly. Would it have made a difference? Probably not, she admitted with unexpected candor. But I might have approached the gate placement with more technical consideration. After she left, I remained on the dock until stars appeared, reflecting on our conversation. Diane wasn't a cartoon villain twirling a mustache and plotting neighborhood domination. She was someone who had found purpose in rules and structure, who genuinely believed she was protecting something valuable, even as her methods became increasingly restrictive. I understood that impulse. Throughout my career, I'd seen how easy it was for people to become entrenched in their positions, to confuse process with progress. I've been guilty of it myself at times. The following Tuesday, I attended the special session. To my surprise, it was well attended, with homeowners from across the community filling the small meeting room. Diane called the meeting to order with her usual efficiency, but there was a different tone to the proceedings, less dictatorial, more deliberative. The board presented proposed revisions to the community guidelines, significantly scaling back restrictive policies and punitive measures. Mandatory fees became voluntary contributions. Aesthetic requirements were reclassified as recommendations. The surveillance system will be limited to common buildings and facilities, not private properties or access points. Most significantly, a new collaborative approach to lake access was introduced, acknowledging the legal rights of property owners while establishing reasonable expectations for shared resources. The gate would remain as a symbolic boundary, but access would be unrestricted for all residents and their guests during daylight hours. When the floor opened for discussion, I found myself stepping forward to offer qualified support for the revisions, acknowledging the legitimate need for some baseline standards while emphasizing the importance of homeowner autonomy. Others spoke, as Welsome still angry, others cautiously optimistic about the new direction. By the end of the evening, a tentative consensus had emerged. The revised guidelines were approved on a trial basis, with a commitment to reassess after 6 months. As the meeting adjourned, several residents approached me, thanking me for taking a stand that many had wanted to but hadn't found the courage or means to do. Frank Morris clapped me on the shoulder as we left the community center. You started something here, Tom. Not a revolution, maybe, but a reset. I just wanted to fish in peace, I told him with a wry smile. Sometimes that's enough of a reason to change things, he replied. Over the following months, a remarkable transformation took place in our small lakeside community. Without the constant threat of fines and violations, residents began taking genuine pride in their properties, maintaining them not out of fear, but from a sense of shared stewardship. Personality returned to the neighborhood. Wind chimes tinkled in the breeze. Bird feeders attracted goldfinches and cardinals. Garden gnomes stood guard over flower beds once again. Diane remained on the board, but adopted a notably different approach, focusing on coordination rather than control. When invasive water lilies threatened a portion of the shoreline, she organized a voluntary community cleanup instead of issuing mandates. When storm damage affected several docks, she facilitated a group repair project, connecting residents with local resources and contractors. The gate still stood where it had been installed, but its meaning had changed. Now it served as a reminder of boundaries respected rather than enforced, of a community that had found its way back to neighborliness from the brink of petty tyranny. As for me, I finally found the peace I'd sought in retirement. My mornings once again belonged to coffee on the dock, watching mist rise from the water as the sun crested the eastern shore. My afternoons were for fishing or reading or simply dozing in my chair, free from the anxiety of violation notices or surveillance cameras. Occasionally, I'd receive a message from a resident asking permission to access the lake through my gate, a courtesy rather than a requirement, but one I appreciated nonetheless. I always granted it, of course. The point had never been to restrict access, but to restore respect. One evening, almost a year after the gate incident, I was returning from town when I noticed a young family struggling with fishing gear at the lake access point. The father was attempting to juggle a tackle box, two children's rods, and a squirming toddler, while the mother consulted a crumpled map, looking confused. "Can I help you folks?" I asked, approaching them. "We're staying at the rental cabin on North Shore Drive," the man explained, shifting his precarious load. "They said there was lake access somewhere along here, but we're not sure if we're allowed." "Of course you are," I assured him, taking the tackle box and one of the rods. "Let me show you a good spot for catching bluegill. The kids will love it." I led them through the gate. Technically, though, I never thought of it that way anymore, and down to a quiet cove where the fishing was always good. As the children squealed with delight at their first catches, their parents thanked me for my hospitality. "We weren't sure what to expect," the mother admitted. "We heard this place used to be really strict about rules and access." "Things change," I told her, watching her daughter reel in a small, fighting bluegill. "Sometimes for the better." Walking back to my cabin in the gathering dusk, I passed Diane on the community path. She nodded in greeting, and I returned the gesture. "Nice family," she commented, having evidently observed my interaction with the visitors. "Their rental agreement includes a copy of our community guidelines." I raised an eyebrow, wondering if old habits were reasserting themselves. Seeing my expression, she actually laughed, a genuine sound I'd rarely heard from her. "Just the basics: water safety, quiet hours, recycling information. Nothing about garden gnomes or wind chimes, I promise." "Progress," I acknowledged with a smile. "Indeed." She hesitated, then added, "The board is considering a proposal to replace the gate with an archway. Same function, different." Implication: your input would be valuable given your, vested interest in structure. "I think that sounds like a fine idea," I told her. "An entrance, not a barrier." She nodded and continued on her way. Clipboard still in handsome habits die hard, but carried differently now, less like a shield and more like the tool it was meant to be. I returned to my dock and settled into my chair, watching as the day's last light painted the water in amber and gold. The gate dispute had never really been about the physical structure, but about what it represented: the line between order and overreach, between community and control. Finding that balance wasn't a single victory, but an ongoing conversation, one that required vigilance, respect, and occasional stubborn resistance when boundaries were crossed. A pair of loons called from the center of the lake, their haunting cry echoing across the water. I closed my eyes and listened, savoring the peace I'd fought for, not just for myself, but for all of us who called this place home. Sometimes the most important boundaries aren't marked by gates or fences, but by the courage to stand one's ground with patience and principle. And sometimes the key to resolving conflict isn't in tearing down gates, but in reimagining what they stand for.